Now let's go to the ABC's Q&A, a program that we've mentioned many times for its partisanship, particularly the disproportionate number of progressives and far-left panellists. And sticking with the theme of this show, censorship by the political elite, it would be a shame not to address the resurgence of the ABC's favourite reformed liberal, Malcolm Turnbull. Now, you might remember Turnbull has recently risen from the ashes of conservatism to become the poster boy for progressive issues. And his disdain for real journalists who were critical of his leadership was on display again, making wildly false claims about News Corp's reporting concerning last summer's bushfires.
The reality is News Corp and Murdoch have done enormous damage to Western democracy and in particular to the United States and Australia and in particular on the subject of global warming. You know, we had 12 million hectares of our country burnt last summer, and your newspapers were saying it was all the consequence of some arsonists.
All the consequences of arsonists? He is claiming News Corp blamed the totality of bushfires on arsonists. And even though the ABC claims to detest false comments being aired, host Hamish McDonald did not ask for any evidence to back up this claim. So we've gone and done some research ourselves, and that claim by Turnbull was untrue. Of the 3,335 News Corp articles about the bushfire from September 1 last year to January 23, only 3.4% of the published stories mentioned arson or arsonists. Now, 3.4% doesn't seem to correspond with the phrase, all the consequence. And in that 3.4% of articles, arson wasn't blamed for sparking every single bushfire. I agree, that claim would be absurd, but the claim was never made. What the Australian did do is report official figures on how many arson cases there were during the bushfire period. Only a fool would think that bushfires were the result of a singular cause. It is clearly quite a complicated, multivariate problem involving lightning strikes, forest management, the changing climate, and yes, arson. And there are probably even more factors at play, such as bureaucratic idiocy. But to highlight a tiny slather of news and analysis and declare that this is evidence of a news organisation's secret agenda is ludicrous. Unlike the ABC, this company attempts to cover all sides of the issues, scrutinising every possible angle of something as deadly and damaging as bushfires. It is the journalists who lay the blame for the bushfires solely at the feet of climate change who are ignoring science. In fact, here is just some samples of the Australians' coverage of the fires, reporting the influence a changing climate has on bushfires and the intensity of which they burn. December 2019, climate change denies fiddle as the nation burns. July 2020, unequivocal link between extreme bushfires and climate crisis. January 2020, in the line of fire, when the smoke has literally and figuratively cleared, Australia must reckon with what the experts assure to us is the new reality: longer fire seasons and hotter, drier climates. And Turnbull wasn't content with making just one outrageous claim against News Corp, this time unloading on the Australian's editor-at-large and one of the most respected political commentators in the country, Paul Kelly.
That is this hyper-partisanship in the media, particularly from the Murdoch press, is a major problem in our democracy, as it is in the United States. Your employer, Paul, has got a huge share of the blame for this. It is a shocking legacy.
I think you exaggerate the impact that we have.
That's what Rupert always used to say to me. He'd say, oh, we don't have a very big audience, we're not that influential. Talk to Lachlan. Look, I've had all of that flannel for years.
As you can see, Turnbull alleges News Corp has a massive and disproportionate influence that's counterproductive to democracy. But here's what Turnbull had to say in 2014 when he was Communications Minister, appearing on Q&A.
And you're living in the past. You're living in the past to think that newspapers, printed newspapers, are still dominating the media and the political scene. And what we've seen now is we've gone from a period where Murdoch absolutely did dominate, certainly the print part of Australian media, and of course pay TV, but to a point where, because of the internet and because of, frankly, publications like The Guardian, online publications, we are seeing more competition and more diversity in our media than we have ever had in my lifetime, certainly. So it is remarkable. So I think the scene has changed.
Talk about glaring inconsistencies that go to the heart of Turnbull's credibility. When Turnbull was in power, he seemed to have a different take on both media diversity and climate change. For someone who was so vitriolic about the media's coverage of climate change, he doesn't really have a leg to stand on. He, for many years, was a leader of this nation, and he achieved little to address the concerns he is suddenly so passionate about. Was he simply too cowardly to speak his mind? Or perhaps he just had nothing to gain? Gemma, he's taken quite a backflip on a number of key issues. What do you make of Turnbull's transformation?
Well, there's a loaded question. I guess, you know, views can change over time. They do. It is quite telling to see such a stark difference in his view when he was a minister and Prime Minister to those he holds now. Look, I think, you know, if you think that newspapers are so influential in 2021, you're not paying, or 2020, I've just given out, I've projected us forward to 2021, you're not paying attention. And in terms of the barriers to entry in the media landscape have never been lower. I could literally start a website tomorrow, employ myself again, call it Gemma's Fabulous News, and credential myself if I joined the union as a journalist. There is literally no barrier to entry. So the idea that there's this horrible conspiracy and you know, situation with News Corp is just, it's not even reflective of fact. And I want to just mention that one thing that we missed before. Mr Rudd was more than happy to enjoy the endorsement of News Corp when he was running to be Prime Minister. He didn't seem to worry about it then. So I think there's a fair bit of urine being extracted right now, Jack. That's
definitely. Louise, what did you make of his Q&A performance? He was pretty harsh on Paul Kelly.
Oh, and that was highly offensive. I mean, Paul Kelly, as you say, is one of our most respected journalists in the country, and generations of journalists like us look up to him because he's prosecuted so many issues politically, socially, everything. He's a fabulous journalist, and his ability is not in question at all. But the fact that Turnbull went for him in that way was appalling. And when, you know, Paul could finally get a word in, his word was excellent. It was basically, it's okay to be a propagandist for climate change, but it's not okay to be a critic. And this is what we see over and over again on the ABC and the left-wing media, is that you can't question any issue around it because you're shouted down. The noise is just drowned out.
And Chris, what about how we were just talking, the ABC, they don't like when you quote his words because they claim that's inaccurate. But Hamish McDonald, he didn't really do anything to bat away the false claims by Turnbull.
Look, that was the worst night in the ABC's recent history. They really just absolutely shamed themselves from go to woe, and Q&A was the pinnacle of that. Look, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull have both been so unfairly treated by the powerful, insidious forces of News Corp that each of them rose to lead their own political parties twice. And each of them actually contested federal elections that they won. That's how bad News Corp has been for them. It is a nonsense. And Paul Kelly was so right when he bravely and correctly said to Malcolm Turnbull's face that you are looking to blame others for your own political failures. And both of these men destroyed their political careers because of their lack of policy and political judgment, strangely enough, both on climate policy, and yet now they try to rewrite history. It's very, very sad to see. And when it comes to bushfires and climate policy, what Malcolm Turnbull wants is an alarmist, extremist point of view pushed into papers that wants to blame bushfires on climate change, when on this program, on Sky, in other News Corp publications, we've talked about the fact that you will always get ignition and we will always have catastrophic bushfires. The one thing we can't change is the weather and the climate in this country, so we have to focus on fuel management and planning and prevention.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, one of the scariest points to me is having someone who's so powerful at the level of a Prime Minister adjudicating what is news.
Well, that's the heart of it. I mean, governments shouldn't be in the business of saying what's news. Governments are in the business of saying this is what is happening, this is the announcement we are making, and those who call themselves journalists are in the business of interrogating, pressure testing, criticising, as we have all agreed, and poking and prodding to establish, is that in fact truth? Where are the holes in this announcement? Budgets are a great example. Is that new money, or is that money that's been announced 3 or 4 times before and shuffled around? You know, it's a great example. But what we see in increasingly in these days is a media that doesn't question. It regurgitates.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to go back to the US now, because we've all seen Twitter's censorship of claims that Donald Trump is making about election fraud. But it is curious to note that in 2014, when Biden's now chief of staff, Ronald Klain, tweeted that elections were rigged, Twitter did not actually censor him. Now, Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, because this is quite a damning tweet which has been dug up. It's verified. He did tweet this. This is now the guy who's going to be the chief of staff to a Joe Biden presidency, and he's just been on their Twitter, deriding elections.
Oh, absolutely, mate. This is exactly the point. They're only interested in fact-checking one side of politics, and it's very questionable what they do there. There was a New York Times reporter, Kevin Noon, I think his name was, Kevin Roos, who this week tweeted out 4 stories on Facebook that he said were looking to undermine the election result. Well, every one of those stories happened to be factual. There was going to be a recount in this state. There was going to be a Department of Justice investigation in this state. There were calls for the resignation of an election official in this state. They were all factual. And then he had to tweet, well, yes, stories can be actually factually correct but seek to undermine the election. That's how nutty these people are. It is just extraordinary. And Joe Biden, remember, he's been going around saying that Donald Trump banned all Muslim immigration. He's not fact-checked on that. Has anybody at Twitter or Facebook ever fact-checked Barack Obama for proudly proclaiming in 2008 that this was the moment the oceans stopped rising and this is when the planet began to heal? Why don't we fact-check that?
Louise, what do you reckon? Do you think that people should be fact-checked? I mean, doesn't that make these platforms publishers and not platforms?
Well, exactly, it does. I mean, they should be held responsible for what's on their platforms. But I sort of take a bit of a voyeuristic thrill when I see people who are now in administration and their old tweets are dug up and shown. Actually, their hypocrisy is completely exposed. So I look forward to more of that coming in the next few weeks.
Definitely. And Gemma, what do you take of the way that the tech giants have made themselves almost the referee in this debate? Yeah,
I mean, to a point, it's power we've given them, isn't it? Like, you get the news you tolerate, you get the platforms you tolerate. I mean, Chris is the smart one. He abandoned Twitter ages ago. I'm more on a restrictive diet, which has been very good for me. But in all honesty, they absolutely are publishers. The sooner they are treated as and held to the same level of account as other publishers, the better for everyone. But I would also say this, if you're a person who's taking your news information only from a Facebook page, then you need to reassess your life choices.
Now, that is very true as well. Chris, I'm really keen to get your thoughts on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's public feud that's playing out in the media. They've labelled her selfish, divisive bomb thrower, and she's been blamed for the loss of some houses in the lower house over there. She now is taking a very forward step, trying to rebuke some of these claims, but it appears that the Democratic Party is a little bit fractured.
Yeah, well, they certainly are, because let's face it, they've not performed well in this election. They look like narrowly getting the White House, but as you mentioned earlier, they won't get a majority in the Senate, and they've reduced their majority in the House. So it's not been a great performance from them against supposedly the worst president the country's ever seen. Well, then how come they couldn't defeat them more convincingly? And her and the so-called squad, the far-left Democrats, and they're led, their icon, their hero, is Bernie Sanders. They've been publicly saying, even before the election, that their plan was to get Biden into the White House and then push him to become the most progressive president since FDR. So that's their agenda. They want Biden to be their puppet to go further left. Well, thankfully, because of what's happened with the Senate and the House, they might be constrained in doing that. But it's a pretty sad state of affairs. I just want to add in, we're talking about Malcolm Turnbull. I always have to point out that I was his chief of staff in 2009, so that's a public declaration. But also, when you talk about climate and reporting and News Corp and all the rest of it, who does he cite? The news organisation he always cites for balance and truth and objectivity is The Guardian, the most left-wing global organisation, and it's the organisation he actively set up in Australia. He secretly and actively set up The Guardian Australia and even handpicked their political journalists. That's exactly how he likes his media.